Our Savior Jesus Christ destroyed death and brought life to light through the gospel.
The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a large crowd gathered around him, and he stayed close to the sea. One of the synagogue officials, named Jairus, came forward. Seeing him, he fell at his feet and pleaded earnestly with him, saying, "My daughter is at the point of death. Please, come lay your hands on her, that she may get well and live." He went off with him, and a large crowd followed him and pressed upon him. There was a woman afflicted with hemorrhage for 12 years. She had suffered greatly at the hands of many doctors and had spent all that she had. Yet she was not helped, but only grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. She said, "If I but touch his clothes, I shall be cured." Immediately her flow of blood dried up. She felt in her body that she was healed of her affliction. Jesus, aware at once that power had gone out from him, turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who has touched my clothes?" But his disciples said to Jesus, "You see how the crowd is pressing upon you, and yet you ask, 'Who touched me?'" And he looked around to see who had done it. The woman, realizing what had happened to her, approached in fear and trembling. She fell down before Jesus and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "My daughter, your faith has saved you. Go in peace and be cured of your affliction." While he was still speaking, people from the synagogue official's house arrived and said, "Your daughter has died. Why trouble the teacher any longer?" Disregarding the message that was reported, Jesus said to the synagogue official, "Do not be afraid, just have faith." He did not allow anyone to accompany him inside except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they arrived at the house of the synagogue official, he caught sight of a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. So he went in and said to them, "Why this commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but asleep." And they ridiculed him. Then he put them all out. He took along the child's father and mother and those who were with him, and entered the room where the child was. He took the child by the hand and said to her, "Talitha koum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." The girl, a child of 12, arose immediately and walked around. At that, they were utterly astounded. He gave strict orders that no one should know this, and said that she should be given something to eat. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
So my daughter, oldest daughter, who is in Corpus Christi, Texas right now, doing clinicals for a nursing program, posted on Facebook just earlier in the week some of the things she got to do, stuff I don't know about, like catheters and main lines, and she ended it saying, "Even got blood on my gloves. What a great day at the hospital." So she must have helped somebody stop bleeding. So that's all good, and I'm glad she has found something she likes to do and loves to do, and that she loves to do that. But that stuff, that just gives me the creeps. I can't stand blood. If I look at it, it makes me faint. So when they're drawing blood, when you go to the doctor, I always look like this, and they always ask, does that bother you? I'm like, oh yeah. And if you don't want to pick me up, don't make me look. So I don't look. But even with that, this story of the woman with the hemorrhage in this gospel is one of my favorites of all time. And I'll tell you why in a couple minutes. So we have this woman, right, who has a hemorrhage, and she's been bleeding for about 12 years. And she has spent everything she has on doctors trying to get better. But it doesn't work. And she just gets worse. And they cause her to suffer even more. But it says she heard about Jesus. So somebody told her about Jesus. And whoever told her about him must have known him. Because they sure did convince her and gave her enough faith to know that if she just touched his cloak, that she would be healed. So I pictured that scene, Jesus going to Jairus' daughter's house with that mob of people, and this woman's kind of standing at the side until she locks her eyes on Jesus. And once she sees him, she makes her way towards him. Whatever it takes, but never loses her focus. She's going to Jesus. So she pushes people out of the way, crawls if she needs to, walks sideways if she needs to, whatever she needs to do to get to Jesus. She's going to him. And before long, she's right next to him. And she reaches out and touches his cloak. And she's healed immediately, and she knows it. So that's the first reason I like this gospel story. Because we can put ourselves in her shoes, right? And no matter how messed up our lives get, if we have faith like her and make our way through our crowd and just keep our focus on Jesus, all we need to do is reach out and touch him. And we'll be okay. So, as soon as Jesus was touched, he knew it, right? He could feel the power go out from him. So he asked his disciples around him, it's like, hey, who touched my clothes? And they're like, Jesus, are you kidding? Do you see all these people? They're pushing and shoving and bumping into you? And you're asking who touched you? Are you kidding? And Jesus says, no. Really? Who touched me? And he's looking around to find the person he felt touch him. And the woman comes forward. And she's afraid, and she's trembling. Now, I think she's afraid because what she did was against the law. Because she had been bleeding for 12 years, she is considered unclean. She's just like a leper. And if you are unclean, you're not allowed to touch anybody else. And if you do, they become unclean. And she touched Jesus. So she was probably afraid of what he was going to say. And she was trembling. And I don't think the trembling was out of fear. I think she was trembling because she was just overwhelmed with his presence. She knew whose presence she was in. She knew who she touched. She knew she touched the Son of God and not just some other man. And then what did Jesus do? Did he yell at her? Said, you shouldn't have touched me, now I'm unclean? No. He looked at her and said, my daughter. And that's the second reason I like this gospel reading. Because I'm a dad and I have 2 daughters of my own. And I know the deep and special love that I have for each of them. And it's a different love than I have for my wife. It's a different love than I have for my brothers and sisters. It's different from the love I have for my parents. It's a special love that a dad has for his daughters. That's the love Jesus had for this woman. Even more than that. If I have that love for my daughters, how much more does he love his daughter? How much more does he love all of us? Last weekend I wasn't here, and I was with the youth group at Franciscan University in Steubenville. Dan Schmidt conned me into going, because he couldn't go for some reason. I don't know. And if you don't know what this is, it's a very powerful weekend for high school students mainly. It's filled with praise and worship music, mass, confessions. They did 1,300 confessions that weekend. And adoration, all that good Catholic stuff. And they have some pretty good speakers there too. And the weekend not only touches and affects the high school students that go, it'll touch and affect the adults that are there chaperoning too, if they're open. And there were a couple really good talks that reminded me how much Jesus loves me. I felt the love he had for his daughter in that story. Even made man tears, like Father Steve calls them, flow a little bit. The highlight of that weekend, though, is adoration on Saturday night. And it's kind of done like we do here, with praise and worship music, incense, and Jesus processes up and down the aisles. Only there, it's amongst 2,000 people. And before the priest started his procession, he referred to this gospel story. He said, there was a woman with a hemorrhage that knew if she just reached out and touched Jesus' cloak, she would be healed. And he said, any of you that would like to reach out and touch the veil, feel free to do so. And then he began his procession. So as he came, this is in a basketball gym or whatever, and as he came around to our area, we were sitting next to an aisle. One of the young ladies that was with us was so overcome and overwhelmed with the love of Jesus because he was so close to her that she just kind of collapsed. And the people around her pushed chairs out of the way and held her and kind of gently laid her on the floor. And she just rested there in Jesus' love, just in total peace. So when I saw this, I went over and stood next to her so that nobody would step on her or trip on her or kick her or hurt her or anything like that, just to make sure she was safe. And after about 20 minutes, I noticed a woman standing next to us, an older woman who was a chaperone, who was just praising Jesus. She was trembling. She was becoming unsteady on her feet. People were getting ready to catch her. The problem was, if she fell, it was going to be right on top of this girl that we were with. So by that time, she was starting to come around, so I just offered her my hand, and she took it. I stood her up and offered her a seat, but she didn't want to sit. She says, I want to stand. I want to see Jesus. So she was still very unsteady, so I put my arm around her shoulder. She rested her head on this shoulder, and we watched Jesus process up and down the aisles. About 20 minutes after that, the priest was walking towards the altar with Jesus, so I thought, okay, we're about done. And a thought popped into my head, a word, a message, whatever, and said, I'm coming back to you. Like, okay, I don't know what that means, but whatever. Somebody's coming back to me. So as the priest approached the altar, he continued his procession. He kept going. He walked over to our aisle, our side of the gym, our aisle, and he turned down our aisle. So I think I knew who was coming back to me. So he's walking with Jesus down the aisle, and he comes to where we're standing, me and this young lady, and he stops, and he turns and looks at us, bows his head, extends his arms, and puts Jesus right in front of us. So when that happened, I asked this young lady, would you like to touch the veil? And she just said, yes. So she reached out her hand, but she was trembling so much, just like I imagine this woman in this gospel trembling, that she couldn't quite reach it. So I grabbed her wrist, extended her arm, and she gently touched the veil. And that moment, I heard the voice of Jesus say, my daughter. So after that, the priest looked up at us, pulled Jesus to himself, turned, and finished his procession. Well, after that, both of us had to sit down because we were both uneasy and I couldn't hold her anymore. So what does that have to do with us? I think it tells us the stuff that happened 2,000 years ago, that woman that went up and touched Jesus and was healed, it is still happening today. Because Jesus is still alive, and we can still do that. No matter how messed up our lives are, no matter how much we hurt, no matter how broken we are, if we have the faith of that woman and can push our way through that crowd, whatever separates us from Jesus, all we need to do is reach out and really touch him, and we'll be okay. And you know what? We're going to have a chance to do that in a couple minutes here tonight. When you go up to communion and you hold out your hands to touch Jesus, don't be like the people in the crowd that just bumped into him. Really touch him. Really feel him. Because you know what? We are his daughters. We are his sons. And man, he really loves us.